It should have been the sound of frogs and leaves, and a campfire doing its slow work, background noise that reassures you the world keeps spinning. Instead, the woods went completely silent. No crickets, no distant tires on a farm road, no wind in the pines. Everything that ought to be there stopped breathing for a beat, and in that impossible hush, the first story arrived. I was not alone when I felt it. I was sitting on the tailgate of an old pickup, a thermos between my knees, the fire down to coals. A woman I'd met the day before on a stretch of two-lane called the silence an omen. She said, "When the forest holds its breath, something is watching." I laughed then, because that's what you do around strangers in the dark. But she looked at the tree line like she meant it, and the way the night tightened around us made the laugh sound small. These 7 stories all came to me in this same way, shared across a fire, in the back of a truck, over a shaky phone call from a stranger pulled off the side of a highway. Different places, different people, the same small detail, silence arriving like a physical thing, like someone closing a hand over the world. Each one begins ordinary and ends with that moment where the sound goes. In some, a human malice is the obvious answer. In others, there's something that feels older and more patient than any person. In all of them, people walk on the edge of things they can't explain. The first was told to me by a woman who still sleeps with a nightlight. She gave me her name and then asked me not to use it. The way strangers worry about curses, superstition is cheaper than the truth, she said. Her voice kept catching on the words, like the memory had sharp edges. She was 11 when it started. Her parents were young, working all week and running errands on Saturdays. That night they had a dentist appointment, the kind of appointment that feels grown up in a child's house. The car left, lights on to make the house look occupied, a casserole in the oven. She remembers the kitchen smelling like bread and a blue blanket over the sofa. It was cold enough that the breath from her mouth fogged the living room window when she pressed her face to it. The house felt safe because it had routine. At 9:12 p.m., the phone rang. It was one of those long, thin telephones with a curly cord that leaned toward the wall. She answered because children answer phones. The line held silence on the other end for 3 seconds, 2, then a single exhale, the kind of breathing you hear when someone holds back a laugh, or when someone is testing how long they can go without being heard. She hung up and told herself the neighbor had dialed the wrong number. The phone rang again 15 minutes later, a short, insistent ring. This time, the voice on the other end wasn't silence. It was breathing, close to the mouthpiece. And then a scrape, like someone rubbing a thumb along the edge of a key. She went to her parents' bedroom and listened at the door. The house was still. The radiator hummed in a distant room. The breathing came through the receiver as if the caller were standing at the foot of the staircase. She hung up again, but the calls kept happening. One in the middle of the night, another at dawn, then a cluster the next evening. The pattern felt wrong. It wasn't just prank calls. The voice would breathe, sometimes make a small sound like a laugh swallowed, and then a rustle that could have been a jacket or a coat. Once, while she was in the bathroom brushing her teeth, she felt the slight vibration of the doorknob move. She told herself the wind had caught it. The wind did not live in that hallway. The night the lights went out is the one she remembers most vividly. She was sitting on the bathroom floor with a toothbrush in her mouth when the overhead light fizzed and died, the bulb ejecting a tiny last spark. For a second, everything was black, and her breath was loud inside her chest. In the dark, she heard the phone ring. Once, twice, 3 times, and then silence, shorter than before. Then the bathroom door eased inward by the width of a finger, as if someone tested the latch and decided to leave it closed. She froze, toothpaste foam filling the corner of her mouth, and in the dark, she prayed the adult prayer she had learned at school. Don't make noise. Don't make a sound. Her parents came home an hour later. The house looked normal. The casserole had cooled on the stove. She told them about the calls. They called the non-emergency police line. Officers came and took her statement, writing down the time and the descriptions of sounds. Not much more they could do in a house with no evidence. The calls stopped for 3 nights and then started again. They switched the number. They unplugged the phone. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the ringing stopped. No one ever traced the calls. No one ever came up the walk. The thing she remembers is how small she felt afterward, how the house that had always been a protection now had edges she didn't know how to touch. Years later, she still jumps at the phone. She says she learned to listen for the silence that comes before the call, the lonelier quiet that says someone is testing the borders. She sleeps with a nightlight, and when the power blinks, she sits very still until she hears the clatter of dishes or the whir of a refrigerator, a way to prove the world is still in its place. The forest folded its breath over the clearing, and for a moment even the fire seemed to listen. The woman beside me rubbed her palms together and said we were lucky it had been only a phone call. Then she told me the second story, a call that wasn't just a prank, and a case that would haunt officials for years. This one started on a highway that runs through flat country, where the night swallows light fast, US 277, a long stretch of 2-lane that has more deer than diners.
Deputy Mark Evans was driving a beat he knew by the weight of the radio and the crackle of tires on old asphalt. He'd been with the county for years and had learned to trust the small things. The way fog sits in a ditch, the way a pickup looks when it's dead on the shoulder. Dispatch had routed him to a truck partly in the lane around 1:10 a.m. It was a pickup, a Ford, parked at an angle like someone had jumped out of it and run. Inside, the keys were in the ignition and the driver's door was open. There were pieces of a meal on the console, a styrofoam cup, a folded paper bag. The radio picked up an answering call, a voice thin with something that felt like panic. Before Deputy Evans reached the cab, a maroon Chevy idled past like a witness, someone who could not stop themselves from looking. There was no driver in the truck, no footprints in the gravel, no sign of a struggle. The cab smelled faintly of gasoline and winter breath. A cell phone lay on the passenger seat. Evans called the number while he scanned the tree line. The phone had one missed call, then a voicemail waiting. A young man's voice, ragged and fast, saying someone was following him, that they were out there. The recording had an edge, static, a low hum, a rustle as if a hand had snagged something fabric. Then a final exhale and the line cut. The deputy's radio crackled like an insect. Rangers and helicopters came. Dogs ran that night, and the next, tongues lolling, noses down. Search grids cut into the black like stitches. A neighbor led them to a fence where a bent wire suggested someone had climbed. A pair of boots was found a day later, soaked and thumbed with mud, but no one to match them. Weeks became months. Deputies held press conferences and tried to keep the search visible so something wouldn't be allowed to sink into oblivion. They found traces, scattered receipts, a camping chair in a roadside ditch, but nothing that made sense until years later when bones were found miles away in a remote ravine that only the most determined hikers passed. DNA confirmed a name, Brandon Mason Lawson. That should have been an end, a closed sentence. Instead, the finding became a different kind of open wound. There was no conclusive cause of death recorded, no arrests that produced a confession that squared with what the call had suggested on that night of the empty truck. People make theories. Some think it was foul play, some think it was an accident. Some whisper about the country in between being a place that takes people and forgets. The official records, as far as the deputy could tell, resisted a clean answer. The radio reports dryly, remains found and identified. The families get the bones and the paperwork. The rest is a private, sharp absence. When I asked the deputy about the silence, he told me about the moment he reached the truck and the night pressed so hard he could hear his own blood. You get the uncanny sense, he said, that whatever took him was patient. He didn't use the words supernatural. He didn't need to. Patience in the dark is a kind of thing that aligns with the hush you feel before a predator pounces or before a storm drops its weight. The forest there is low cedar and mesquite. It's not the tallest trees, but it knows about keeping secrets, about bending around a sound and hiding it under leaf litter. When it goes very quiet, he told me, the thing you need to fear is not what you can see with a flashlight. It's what won't give itself away. The leaves held their breath. The next story I was given came through the static of an old scanner and the pain of a man who learned the worst phone call a parent can receive. He was a night shift security guard, the sort of person who can tell you when the fluorescent lights in a warehouse burn the same way week after week. He'd built a life on routine. Lock at 10, patrol at 2, coffee at 3. His son came home from school and fell asleep on the couch with homework scattered like confetti. The man's wife worked days. The guard's hours were supposed to give their family coverage and comfort. At 2:14 a.m., the phone at the security desk rang, and a voice told him in calm, clipped sentences that they had his son. They had his son and they wanted money. The voice was precise, like someone reading directions. In the background of the call, there was what the guard swore later he recognized as his son's voice, sobbing, interjected with a muffled order. "It's him. Tell him to get the bag." The caller named a time and a place. He named a number to send money through, some arcane method of transfer the guard had never used before. There is a cold kind of logic to these moments. The mind goes to the work of getting the money, to protocols and the way police advise you not to do things, and to the pretend bureaucracy of kidnappers who use scripts. He called 911. Officers told him to play along, to let them trace and set a sting. Surveillance footage from the bank would later show a man with a hood and gloves, but when the bag exchange was set up, something went wrong. The decoy bag used by police was grabbed and the suspect ran. In the chase, the car that bore the kidnappers escaped down an interchange and vanished into gridlock or into planning nobody could later reconstruct. The morning after was what broke him. A package arrived on their doorstep, not something they had agreed to accept, not a decoy. Someone left a box with a note and a thing inside the box that made the world tilt. There are ways to say what happened without saying it. The guard spoke to me like someone sifting for the right words. He didn't want to give the color of things that would make you unable to look away, so he kept it to the effect. They had been given what they had feared. Later investigations led to arrests. 3 men were taken into custody, and according to court records and press reports, statements and a trial followed.
The legal language is dry and does what language does when it must be blunt about human loss. But in the house where the son used to drum his fingers on a kitchen table, the grief did not file. It spread like an oil stain. When I asked him if the forest had been silent when it happened, he thought about the audacity of that metaphor, and then answered in the way a man who has rehearsed the question does. "There's silence after a scream," he said, "but before, there's this hollow kind of quiet, like the world is holding itself back so it can watch what they do." It wasn't the kind of silence that tells the guard about the presence of coyotes or trucks. It was a silence that sounded like the pause before a gunshot. He sleeps with the lights off now because the darkness is less suspicious than the small, persistent sounds that houses are empty. The trees watched without sound. I met a young man with a different kind of story in the parking lot of a diner halfway between the interstate and the woods. He'd been traveling with friends to Orlando, roller coasters and fantasy vacations, and one night a woman they had met on an app joined the group for drinks. Her name was Michelle. She was 29, or that's how she presented herself. She was talkative on the ride home, louder than the others, the kind of person who fills silence because she either cannot tolerate it or cannot trust it. For a while, she was just another stranger at a table. But then a series of small things stacked. She rearranged people's belongings in the hotel room in ways that felt like testing edges. She took someone else's keys and hid them. She called people at strange hours, or so the narrator recalled, hesitant to betray how ridiculous his memory sounded, even as he told it. The hotel was in the shadow of a theme park.
Unassuming, late-light halls, vending machines humming like small refrigerators. One night, she smashed a lamp against a wall because she said it was too bright. She chased a friend to the bathroom, shoved them into a towel rack until the metal bent. People laughed it off because adrenaline and alcohol make guilt dissolve into anecdotes. They thought they could get on with the trip and not let a guest ruin it. But then the knife appeared. It was quick, a flash of steel as someone lunged. The narrator remembers the sound, metal that smelled like cold and a scrape against the linoleum. He says his heart felt like it was no longer behind any of his ribs, but pounding under his tongue. He ran. He left friends who yelled his name in the hallway. Police came. Michelle was arrested. The reports I read later said charges were filed and then bound over. She posted bond and was out again. The narrator told me that what made his skin hard was not the knife. It was the fact she came back. You assume outside spaces, like hotel parking lots and theme parks, are public and therefore safe in a way private homes are not. That assumption can kill your guard.
In this case, it took the place where the group had trusted in their own numbers and turned it into a place where who you thought you knew could cross a line and leave you scrambling for directions back to trust. Someone the narrator had laughed with and shared fries with became a person he did not know at all. That kind of shift is scarier than any weapon because it suggests a secret you could not have prevented. When he told me the ending, how they drove away in the gray light of morning, how they left friends behind to figure out their statements, he kept mentioning the quiet of the parking lot. It was silent, like the park had been holding its breath, he said. Like even the attractions were respecting something that had happened. He didn't know whether her violence came from a place of illness or malice. The case moved through the justice system in ways he could not control. The trip that was supposed to be a story about roller coasters became a story about a night when normal social life eroded and a person revealed teeth. The leaves held their breath. That's 4 stories that could be read separately, like the pages of a grim photo album. But in every telling, there's a recurring muscle, the pause that inhabits the world just before something breaks. For the 11-year-old, the silence was the space a caller used to measure how much fear to administer. For the deputy on US 277, it was the lead-up to a vanishing that would not be made sense of. For the security guard, it was the hush that made the phone scream louder. For the Florida trip, it was the nothing between a laugh and a knife. Each of those silences is different, but each is the same as a physical fact. A lack so loud it reorganizes how people understand the places they thought were safe. By then, the coals in our small fire had been reduced to a low halo. My thermos had fogged over where my thumb had kept circling the lid, a small ritual of staying awake and keeping the cold at bay. A car passed on the road half a mile off, and for a second the world had a sound again, the engine a human interference. But when it moved on, the woods took the night back, folding themselves quiet and deep. The woman who'd first warned me of the omen stood and stretched, the old muscles making small noises. She pointed to a path that veered away from the clearing, narrower and darker. "There's a place up that way," she said, "a hollow where the trees grow tight. People tell stories about that hollow." We stayed where we were. The conversation turned to questions I had begun to ask with every storyteller. What do you do after? How do you live in the fact of such small, sharp intrusions? People move differently after their lives give them a reason to mistrust silence. They sleep with lights. They become readers of small noises. They avoid certain roads. They don't do what they used to. Sometimes the change is practical, and sometimes it is biochemical, a new churn of adrenaline that rearranges a body's reactions to dark. We could have moved on there. I could have kept the other 3 stories for another night, but the woods felt impatient. I had promised 7, and somewhere between the fire and the hollow came 2 more accounts that fit this theme, and that refused to be left for later. One is a man who called himself Forrest. He was a mechanic by trade, a man who spoke about engines the way other men speak about scripture, deftly, with reverence. He lost his son and retreated to the Catskills to sleep in a tent and wait out the world. He told me he wanted the trees to be honest, to be what they are and not the noise of other people. The hills there are older than fences, soaked with rain and lined with rocks that hold stories. He pitched a tent by a narrow stream and each night listened to water cutting bedrock. On the second night, he saw 2 points of red in the dark like the eyes of a pair of foxes. They hovered between trunks, closer than wildlife ought to be. He blinked and the points stayed. They didn't move like animals. Their stare was deliberate, like someone peering through a curtain at a house. He swore the index of a pale hand tapped the canvas of his tent. He unzipped and there was nothing but an empty thicket and the whine of bugs. He walked down to the ranger station at dawn, hair wet with rain and the shape of exhaustion cutting his face. Rangers Neil and Tom listened, made notes, asked about tracks. There were none that they could find. Weeks later, the man said he glimpsed the eyes in the reflection of his pickup's windshield, as if they had followed him. Every description he offered was hedged with uncertainty. He knew how ridiculous it sounded to say red eyes and pink skin in a world where the rational offered other options. Moths, reflective tape, the god of grief making tricks on a mind that wanted a sighting. The rangers offered reasoned possibilities. The man kept camping. The eyes came and went. Sometimes when he told the story, his voice folded into silence, and the forest seemed to answer him with a stillness that felt like listening. Whether it was a person or animal or something else entirely remained unconfirmed. The effect it had on him was not. We walked the rim of the clearing to feel the cold close in, and a little farther down the road, a house rented out an upstairs suite for weekend parties. One of the last stories came from a woman who had thrown a birthday party at an Airbnb with more people than the living room could realistically hold. She had paid extra for a service that promised waitstaff, sensible for the number of people they expected. The men in vests arrived like a professional touch. They smiled, they poured wine, and they carried trays. At some point, among the music and laughter, she realized someone had tucked a small bundle of gifts into a coat pocket.
She walked past a man who had been handling the gifts and found him gone in a flash. She found him later in the backyard, a pocket knife shining in his hand. He had been caught with someone else's watch and wouldn't give it back. They confronted him and he pushed and brandished the small blade. He left, but not before one of the other waiters had moved through the house looking like he had been dusting and instead swapping purses into a laundry bag. They were imposters, wearing uniforms the way a thief wears a suit to a funeral. Later, police found sedatives and evidence suggesting someone had tried to drug the real waiter. An actual employee found passed out the next morning. The hosts were left with the sensation of trust violated in a place they had invited people in. There was no blood that night, but there was a knife and a plan and a quiet that meant doors had been opened and corners had been checked without permission. The woman told me she still checks the back door of any house she goes to, that the idea of someone moving through your party like a ghost has changed her sense of how safe an inside can ever be. The trees watched without sound. By the time the 7th story was told, about a Pizza Hut driver in Tucson threatened by a man who was unstable and later arrested after police chased records and delivery logs, my fingers had gone numb inside my gloves. That story is a reminder that ordinary jobs become dangerous when ordinary people have extraordinary violent outbursts. The young driver's hand is still shaking, in the way you can feel it when someone lives for a while in the memory of a gun being present. He told me that the man came back angry about his order and then later circled the building with a weapon. Staff hid on the floor until sirens replaced the silence. The police did their jobs and the man was arrested. The driver still occasionally leans against the counter and closes his eyes for a beat, as if willing his breath steady. That kind of silence is not the same as the hush in the woods. It is more of a postscript, a residue. When he told the story, he looked up at the trees, as if he expected them to explain something. They offered nothing but the hollow of an old oak and the rustle of leaves far above. People who work at night make a habit of reading silence. In some places, the absence of noise is a signal, either safety or the first clue that something is wrong. The world does not always give you time to decide. As we packed to leave, the woman who had first warned me about the omen walked the path toward the hollow. Her boots crushed dry needles and left a pattern of small, bright prints. She stopped at the lip of a depression where the trees grew close and choked off the sky. For a moment she stood looking in, as if she expected the woods to answer her with a face. The woods offered nothing but the hollow of an old oak and the rustle of leaves far above. People who work at night make a habit of reading silence. In some places, the absence of noise is a signal, either safety or the first clue that something is wrong. The world does not always give you time to decide. As we packed to leave, the woman who had first warned me about the omen walked the path toward the hollow. Her boots crushed dry needles and left a pattern of small, bright prints. She stopped at the lip of a depression where the trees grew close and choked off the sky. For a moment she stood looking in, as if she expected the woods to answer her with a face. Instead, the night swallowed her shape, and the forest went completely silent again, the kind of silence that presses your ears so hard you think you might hear blood. The silence wasn't empty, it was full of attention. I stood there looking into the hollow and felt the weight of all those tellings settle like a cloak. The truth of these stories isn't that they're all the same. The truth is that each one rewired someone's notion of normal. A phone call turned a house into a place you didn't trust anymore. An empty pickup made a community watch the dark and wonder where a man had gone. A ransom demand took a father into a world of legal routine and then left him with nothing but grief. A trip to a theme park turned a stranger into a threat. A tent saw two red lights that couldn't be explained. A party hosted imposters who moved like parasites through a living room. A delivery shift ended with a man circling a restaurant with a gun. Different violences, different outcomes. The tether running through them was that hush, the small, anticipatory silence people felt before the dangerous thing announced itself. We did not end where we began. We walked the ridge and my breath hung in the air like a low smoke. I thought of the deputy's radio static, of the guard's empty hands, of the mechanic who kept seeing eyes, and of the kid who still jumps at a phone. Something about telling the stories in a row made them louder, more consequential. Everything seemed to converge on that one question. When the world goes quiet, what is taking your attention? The hollow seemed to answer by offering only more silence, and that is when the headlights came. A high-beam blur cut across the trees, a vehicle driving too fast for the shoulder. It slowed near the clearing and a man leaned out, his face washed in white light and unsure. He said he had been driving the back road to clear his head and had seen the small campfire, and thought maybe someone needed help. We waved him over, because people do that when they travel lonely miles. He said he was from a town a county over, and that he worked nights, a router of boxes and packages. He had a cigarette between his lips and an expression that said he had something to say, but did not know if now was the right place. He stayed for a few minutes and then mentioned, casually, that he had grown up near the sacred hollow we had been peering into. When I was a kid, he said, you could hear the trees whisper. He did not elaborate, but the way he said it sent a thin shiver through the group. He flicked ash into the coals, which flared like a tiny borrowed sun. He thanked us for the firelight and left without asking for money or directions, and the truck's taillights winked away down the dirt. After he had gone, we counted the stories again, as if the night were a ledger. 7 true accounts, each one an incision made in the body's memory. The woman who had first pointed out the hollow gathered her jacket and offered a small, flat instruction. If you ever hear the forest go very quiet, don't stay to find out why. Move away. Put a road between you and whatever watches. I think that's a sensible line, but I also think there is another thing going on. An impossible curiosity that drives people into hollows and down shoulders of highways where they listen for news. Curiosity and a stubborn belief that you can hold on to the ordinary world by paying attention. Or maybe it is guilt. Or maybe people tell these stories to feel less alone. Whatever the reason, the hollow remained silent as we left. The road back was dark and narrow. At one point, my headlights caught movement in the upper branches of a maple, and for a heartbeat, the shape looked like a person. I slammed on the brakes for reflex, my stomach folding. The shape was a raven, glossy and unrepentant, flapping out into the night and leaving the tree empty. I breathed out, and the sound was loud in the little cab. We drove until the lights of town glowed like a promise, and the radio picked up a weak country song. The stories began to settle into me like stones in a backpack, shifting and making small pains on my shoulders. There are some things that don't let you off easy. They lodge and make calls against your ribs. I promised myself I would write them down the next morning, while the dirt was still fresh on my shoes. When you tell 7 true accounts with the same motif, silence like a curtain, that motif accumulates an idea power. It starts to demand not only the specifics, but the connective tissue. Why does a forest go silent before a strange event? Is it a trait of places? Is it a trait of the people inside them? Or is silence itself a weapon that sharpens fear and makes ordinary threats feel like something else? The hollow remained empty under moonlight. We left tire tracks in the dirt that the first rain would smooth. The fire died to coals that breathed heat for a while and then ceased. Somewhere back in a house, an 11-year-old's phone chimed. Somewhere else, a deputy checked his inbox. A father dressed in the dark, a man packed his tools and drove away on a road that curves like a question. For now, nothing answered the silence. And yet it is the silence I keep hearing when I try to sleep, an attentiveness that is not comfort but a warning. It is the same silence that pressed when the deputy opened the pickup door, the silence that let the phone scream into a living room, the silence that followed the scraping of a knife. It's a shape you can put your ear to and listen. Is that wind, or is someone holding their breath? We stopped at a lookout that night to divide the maps and the thermos. The stars were sharp like the points of stories. I told them I would keep the rest for another night, because some things need to be told in the unbroken dark. They warned me not to go back alone to that hollow. I promised I would not. When I headed back the next morning, the bones of the camp were bare, and a raccoon had been through the trash. A cigarette butt lay in the ash pile. That last image made a slow burn in me. Someone having been near the fire after midnight, someone awake. Who was that man with the cigarette? Who drives through hollows and stops only to see? Maybe he was just another traveler. Maybe he had a story that connected to the others in ways I could not yet know. I drove with the windows up, the forest sliding past like a dark scroll. The radio was dead between stations. The only sound was the tires, and when I slowed, the small, loud rush of my own breathing. As the road took me away from the hollow, I felt a sensation I had felt before, the world pressing like a hand to my chest and testing for a pulse. There are more stories, voices I promise to carry back to listeners, people who will tell you that silence was their first clue, or their last. I had 6 in full and 1 half-told that sounded like it wanted to be folded into the rest. I had promised a sequence: ordinary, inciting noise, a climb into dread, and then a closing that refuses to be neat. I had kept it so far. The road narrowed and the forest closed in again. My headlights hit a deer at the edge of the shoulder, and it bounded away with that small, machine-like grace of animals who do not know what a light is. For a moment, the night felt entirely alive again. Then it drained, and for the 10th time that hour, silence came. A silence that felt like a hand waiting to knock. I kept driving, feeling the stories settle behind me like dust. The hollow was still in front of me at the edge of the day, and that image, of the trees holding their breath, has a way of following you like a shadow. Somewhere in the branches, something watched. I knew the rest of the tales were there, waiting for me, quietly patient in the dark. If you're the sort of person who likes this slow burn, true stories told with the trees around them,
Take a second and subscribe. I'll be bringing more nights like this. I kept driving until the road pinched down to a single lane, and the map on my phone blinked, recalculating like it needed convincing. The hollow trailed me until a rise swallowed it. For a long stretch, the world was nothing but the low thrum of tires and the occasional thunk of a branch skittering across the hood. My mind kept returning to the radio static that had been so present in the deputy's memory, and to the child's breath on the line. Stories have a way of unthreading you. I decided to follow up on a few of them. Some people tell you things once and disappear. Others want witnesses, someone else to hold their small ledger of facts so the memory does not go lonely. I went first to a command post on a county lot where years before, search teams had gathered around the missing man's abandoned truck. The lot smelled like old coffee and fuel.
A faded banner over a trailer still bore the sheriff's department emblem. Deputy Mark Evans was there the day Brandon Lawson's truck was found. He agreed to speak again when I knocked and said my name. He was quieter than I expected. Years on a beat make you plain. Lines at the corners of the eyes, hands that do not startle. He told me what he remembered with the exacting patience of someone who has learned the value of details. The angle of the truck, the smell in the cab, the way radio voices fold into one another after midnight so that you sometimes hear the same syllables echoing. He did not offer speculation. He gave me the things you could put in a report: timelines, search grid sizes, the number of personnel, the way the dogs would run until their tongues hung out like scarves. But he also told me about the moments that do not go into reports. He described stepping up to the cab and being hit by a silence so precise he could feel its shape. It's like the air gets thick, he said. You come to expect certain sounds, wind in the grass, trucks down the highway, and when they're missing, your whole rhythm changes. You're listening for a human rhythm, a breath, a footfall. When you don't hear it, the first thought is always, where is that rhythm? He folded his hands and rubbed the pad of his thumb in a slow circle. Years later, you learn to be suspicious of that pause. We walked a few steps to the far edge of the lot where the gravel gave way to scrub. He pointed out a drainage ditch he had stood over at 3 in the morning, the bite of chill that had cut through his coat. He wanted me to understand the way landscape keeps secrets. Not that the land does anything itself, but that human things hide in the land and the land helps them to go quiet. He said that when remains were found and DNA confirmed a name, it did something legally. It closed a case in a file. It did not close the pocket of nothing left in a family's house. I think the part that gets me is how ordinary everything looked that night, he said. A pickup, coffee cups, the world arranged itself like normal and then wasn't. I left the lot with the smell of diesel in my nostrils and a new, low attention to the way hedgerows breathed outside the window. The deputy's tone settled in me. Patient things can operate in patient places. From there, I drove to meet the security guard whose life had been rerouted by a voice on a desk phone. He agreed to speak at a diner because his kitchen still felt like a trap. Too many sharp memories hung there. He came with the posture of someone who has practiced saying the same sentence many ways, so that each telling will feel, somehow, smaller. It's a kind of calculus, he told me. You learn how to do the math of fear. They tested the boundaries. They told you where to put the bag. They told you when they'd make the noise. They made you role-play a scenario until you lost the silliness of it. His hands, large and knuckled, wrapped the coffee mug like a small gesture of containment. He described waiting out the sting, the way officers had arranged a decoy and how the hooded man had grabbed at a bag and then disappeared into traffic. He did not dwell on the final packages that arrived that morning. He let the silence say what the box could not. He then told me, quietly, that arrests had been made later. He used the word accountability like a technical term, but his face softened when he said confessions, a word that both relieved and did not heal. You still wake up and reach for a sound that isn't there, he said. You still look at doors to make sure they're latched. He told me about grief in practical terms. Days you don't answer counts, attempts to find routine that won't let the world tip. The silence before the call, he said, felt almost like a testing, something listening for how much noise would be added and how much could be subtracted.
From the diner, I went north into a tree line that trimmed into the Catskills where Ferris camped. He met me at a ranger station in a vinyl jacket and with eyes that read the horizon the way some people read scripture. He had taken to the hills after losing his son. He said he needed a place that did not pretend to be other than it was. He wanted honest noise. He told me of the first night the eyes appeared. I expected animals, he said. I was expecting raccoon, maybe an owl. What I saw did not move like that. 2 dots, right on my axis, not flickering, not the kind of reflection you can rationalize away. He spoke the sentence with a hesitance that meant he had sharpened its words many times. Rangers Neil and Tom, who had logged the call, told me later that they had looked for tracks, for anything. They found nothing that convinced them. They offered hypotheses, reflective tape on jackets, phosphorescent insects, even the human mind filling in patterns when grief has made the world a smaller map. But when the man insisted the points were too steady to be insects, they took notes and watched him leave. I slept later that night in my truck in a gravel turnout a few miles from where he camped. The woodline wasn't thick there, the trees were older, their branches like the ribs of sleeping beasts. I wanted to see, or at least to feel, the hush myself. The first hours were a small mercy: leaves, distant tires, the clank of a metal sign in wind. Midnight arrived and then pushed past like a slow tide. The crickets died sometime after 1 a.m., and the wind became a thing that did not move. I sat with a thermos and the moon slid a silver scythe between the trunks. For a while I convinced myself the silence was merely a drop, an absence like a missing instrument in an orchestra. My body kept waiting for the next beat. At 2:18 a.m., the silence deepened, as if an agreement had been reached. It was not sudden, but it felt deliberate. My breath became loud the way Deputy Evans had said. I imagined eyes in the trees. I imagined a pale hand tapping thin canvas. I felt ridiculous. I felt the exact sensation of every storyteller who had hedged their claim with, "I don't know what it was." I slept badly, waking to the raw sound of my own pulse. Back in town, the Airbnb host who had been robbed at her own party wanted me to see how her house had changed. She had once hosted birthdays with candor and comfort. She now hosted in a way that counted exits. I put my purse by my foot, she said, like a small ritual. If I go to another person's house, I stand near the door. I like to know where the exits are. She told me that the imposters had been surgical about where they moved, peripheral, polite, a body that belonged to a uniform. She did not use the word predatory. She chose instead to catalog the way grief built new maps. Her wedding ring had become a small, sensible thing, something to keep your hands busy. I wanted to speak to the delivery driver in Tucson, but he asked to keep a low profile. Work is a precarious thing when you live where your job makes you visible. We met briefly in a parking lot near a strip mall. He was young, with a habit of rubbing his shoulder as if it ached. He kept the details clipped to necessities. A man had repeatedly called with a complaint about a spicy order, had returned, had escalated, had circled and threatened. Police records showed an arrest later, he said, but what remained was the film in him. Sometimes you think it'll never get quiet, he said, and then it does, but it's not that comforting quiet. It's like your body is waiting for something else to happen. The Orlando hotel story came back through the friend who had been there. He had tried to make sense of a woman who could be charming and then terribly violent. He told me about many small tests, the moving of keys, the lamp thrown, the knife that changed everything. He watched his friend's notions of normal rearrange themselves. He woke in the gray and never quite felt the park the same way. He kept Snapchat logs and screenshots for himself like talismans. He found that regular, ordinary things, a seatbelt clicking, an elevator ding, could trigger the old memory. You think you can read people, he said. You think you know what small things mean. Then someone opens the small things, and it's like their insides are revealed. I spent days assembling the thin traces they let me have. Police reports, press clippings, the ranger's notes, the family photographs. I organized them like someone would lay out footprints across a table to find a step pattern.
I did not find a single seam that explained all of it. What I found instead was an accumulation of small effects. The ways places and moments made people vulnerable, the ways technology both connected and exposed, the ways an empty sound could be more perceptible than a shout.
The forest motif at the center of every tale came from the tellers themselves. They used the word hush, the tree's breath, the leaves holding themselves. The hollow motif was less an explanation than a shared metaphor for the sudden, uncanny pause people felt when danger pressed near. There's something about testing a silence that invites different kinds of answers. You can explain it as technology, call spoofing, routing through servers, people using blocked numbers to mask violence. You can explain it as human tragedies, alcohol, rage, criminal intent. You can explain it as an animal being in the wrong place. You can explain it as grief and sleep deprivation twisting perception. All of these things are true in some measure. None of them cover everything. I kept returning to a detail the 11-year-old had said, that after the calls stopped, she learned to listen for a different emptiness. It struck me as a practice. People learn to read silence the way an experienced driver reads a fog bank. You learn patterns. A certain kind of silence is the humming of a distant highway. Another kind is the tightness under the eaves that tells you someone is crossing your yard. Survivors acquire a new sensory grammar. The guard learned to do the mathematics of a ransom. The deputy learned to trust the small oddities in a vehicle. The host learned to count exits. On the third night after my first trip, I went back to the hollow. This time I didn't go alone. A ranger named Tom agreed to come, and he brought a flashlight with a beam that cut a slice of white through trunks and low ferns. He moved with the confidence of someone who knows which mushrooms are harmless and which are not, the kind of confidence that makes it possible to be calm around the unknown. We stood at the lip of the depression, where the trees boxed the sky into a narrow, starless square. The earth smelled like damp leaves and old things. Night pressed in. The hollow made no sound, and it made no decisions. It simply withheld noise as if to see what would happen. We walked inside until the branches thickened and our breath became private. The ranger said little. He listened the way his job demanded he might, noting the direction of faint winds, the absence of animal calls, the tilt of a broken branch. "This place gets quiet sometimes," he said after a long time. "It happens with cold fronts, when insects and birds tuck in. Sometimes it's the way the trees buffer sound. Sometimes it's nothing." He smiled at that last confession and then looked at me, asking without words if I wanted the myth or the fact. I did not get either. Instead, I had an immediate, intimate experience, a small, metallic clinking behind a tangle of brush. I turned and my light hit a scrap of soda can wedged into rot. The sound had the wrong currency. It was not the howl I'd imagined. It was a small, human rest leftover, litter. I laughed then, an uneasy laugh, because sometimes fear makes the smallest thing into a tremor. The ranger laughed too, and for a few minutes the hollow returned to being simply a dip in the trees, rather than a cavity of attention. We left that night with the same unresolved ledger we'd brought. The ranger told me he'd seen hikers come through who told stories about eyes at the edge of tents and lights in the wrong places. He had a folder on his desk of reports that read like a cross-section of human imagination strained through loss. He did not say the word supernatural. He used instead experience and perception, the safe architecture of an official voice. He gave me a pamphlet about wildlife safety and a list of numbers to call in the event of anything. It felt both practical and oddly inadequate in the face of what the storytellers had told me. When I left town, I carried the pamphlet, the deputy's coffee smell, the guard's measured grief, Ferrist's tired insistence, the host's new exit rituals, and the Pizza Hut driver's shaking shoulder. They built like a pile of small stones in my chest. There were practical solutions, locking doors, tracing calls, increased patrols in certain corridors, but there were also the things that do not fix: altered sleep, nervousness in doorways, the knowledge that a person you laughed with might be someone you fear. I thought a lot about technology and its role.
Books and detectives and programs exist to explain how a phone call can be anonymized, how a number in one town can route to another. It is possible, for instance, for a caller to mask a number, or for multiple lines to be staged to sound like different people. Those explanations matter because they tell us what we might defend against. But they do not account for the particular shape of the fear, the way the 11-year-old now jumps at a light flicker, the way a birthday host rearranges seating. The human response is stubbornly bigger than the technical fix. Some nights, I found myself thinking of the men who commit these violations. I do not want to make excuses for them. At the same time, looking for motive is often like trying to read the weather. Patterns show themselves, but they never explain every gust. Anger and convenience, the logistics of crime, the way institutions sometimes fail to protect, those are all factors. In the stories I lived with, the most dangerous element was often the ordinary assumption of safety. People trusted their phones, their friends, their jobs. Crime peddles in on that trust. There was also, to be honest, a current running through these tales that seemed older than human bad faith. The red eyes in the Catskills, the hush before the empty truck. These are the parts of the stories that refused neat boxes. I do not claim to know what they were. I will simply report what the people told me, that they felt watched, that the night tightened around them in a way that was not explained by weather or motors. To them, the silence was not absence, it was an active presence that commanded attention. The final night I spent near the hollow, I decided to do a small human thing. I left behind an object. It was a sweatshirt I had finished with coffee, something I was willing to lose. I tied it over a low branch at the edge of the depression, the way hikers sometimes mark a path, the way people sometimes leave devotional things at a roadside cross. It felt absurd and necessary. I thought of all the survivors who had placed small rituals in their lives to prove to themselves that safety remained possible. Nightlights, seatbelt clicks, keeping the porch light on. The sweatshirt was a little map, a test for my own fear. I slept under a sky that was not friendly to truth-telling. When the first light came and peeled through the trees, it did not reveal a neat explanation. The sweatshirt remained where I had left it, damp with night's breath. I took it down and placed it in the trunk as evidence of having been there. The rangers, if they had wanted, would have written it into a log and found it meaningless. I kept it anyway. On my way back through town, I stopped at a small shop that posted local notices, a place where the community leaves messages about lost dogs and sawmills and pancake sales. There, tacked between a flyer for a church potluck and a flyer about trail maintenance, was a notice about a support group, 3 nights a month, a place for people who had experienced trauma from crimes who wanted to talk. I sat there for a long time in my truck and thought about how so many of these stories ended in small migrations, people moving their lives a little to the side in response to an event. It seemed then like a miracle of human persistence that people spoke up. It was how memory refuses to be swallowed. There are certain practical changes survivors made that I think are worth telling plainly, because they are the difference between continuing and being consumed. They vary. A stranger's number is no longer answered at night. Bags are deposited at the foot of chairs instead of left out. Parents do not leave their kids alone in the house that used to be a sanctuary. Delivery drivers avoid certain streets at certain times. Parties have check-in lists and friend code words. These are not heroic rituals. They are the small, sane things people can do. They are a stubborn attempt to make the world less chaotic by imposing rules on noise. Still, the quiet returns. It will find a way back into a home on a night a power flicks or a highway that swallows a truck. That is the persistent grief of these stories. The ordinary world, once pricked, is always slightly different. People can live in that difference, but they cannot entirely reclaim the old naive comfort the way you can reclaim a lost sweater. One afternoon, I received a text from the woman who had first told me the omen under the tailgate. She wrote a single sentence. I keep thinking about the guy who smoked by the fire after midnight. She had remembered him, as I had, as a passenger who seemed both familiar and strange. She said she had tried to find him later and that he was gone. She asked, privately, if I had pursued him. I replied honestly, I had not. Part of the work we do as listeners is to be witnesses rather than fixers. Sometimes you cannot follow every thread. You can only notice its existence. There are verdicts that come and verdicts that do not. In some of these tales, the law did something: arrests, trials, mentions in newspapers. In others, no tidy legal hand closed the wound. That difference is important because it shows both the reach and the limits of institutions. The guard learned that arrests could be made. The deputy learned that identification could occur years later. But identification does not return what was lost. Arrests do not always yield the sense of safety a person once had. It is a messy calculus. On nights when I am trying to sleep now, I find myself measuring the silence, the quality of it, the way it arranges itself into absence, the way it suggests the possibility of another presence. I have driven the back roads many times since that first trip, more prepared perhaps, or less brave. I find myself checking windows twice. I notice how the forest gives and takes sound. I notice the small human rituals people adopt to prove to themselves that the world is still there. There is also an ethical question that lurks in all of this. How do you tell someone else's fear? How do you balance the need to speak against the need to protect the dignity of people who have been hurt? I tried to honor that tension in every recounting. I asked for names and then checked whether people wanted them used. I used the language the survivors provided. I left out details that would only serve curiosity or spectacle. At the edge of the hollow, in the dark, you could feel how jealous memory is of itself. The last formal thing I did for the series was meet with a small group of people, survivors, rangers, a deputy, a counselor, around a table in a rented hall. We sat under a yellow light that hummed, and I asked simple questions. What do you want people to understand? What would you tell others who might one day sit at a lonely campfire? Answers were practical. Trust your instincts, call someone you know, keep a record. But there were also confessions. People admitted to being lonelier, to the difficulty of going places where they once felt safe, to finding small pleasures again. There were myths about the woods and the hollow. There were jokes, because sometimes a joke is the only medicine left. One woman said quietly, "Your silence is not a warning. Sometimes it is a wound." It struck the room. I think what she meant is that the hush we notice might be the place trauma lives. It is the thing we have learned to listen for because it tells us something has been broken. That line, silence as wound, stayed with me. There are nights when the sky is correctly aligned with memory where I still imagine a more poetic answer, that the land itself marks these tragedies and remembers them in the small language of tree limbs and damp soil. I cannot claim any evidence, but that image, the forest as a ledger, does something to the spirit. It gives a shape to what people try to articulate when they say the trees held their breath. It is not a legal description, it is a metaphor people use to find sense. On my last evening in that area, I drove the hollow road again. The sun was low, and the air had the odor of dust and last season leaves. I pulled off at the same turnout, set the thermos between my knees, and listened. The world was busy with ordinary sound: a dog barking, a distant lawnmower, a truck shifting gears. The forest was not attentive. It was its normal busy self. I felt both relieved and cheated. But I had come to accept that relief is temporary and that the hollow will keep its possible moods. I thought about the child's toothbrush and the way fear entered a house with a phone call, about the deputy and the way a pickup's door could be the hinge to a person's disappearance, about a guard holding his son's memory in the contours of a coffee cup, about a young man on a theme park trip who learned that strangers can hide knives behind smiles, about the mechanic who saw red eyes and wondered if grief had painted them, about a party host who learned that uniformed politeness can be a costume for theft, about a delivery driver who learned how thin the veil is between an order and danger. Each of those narratives came back to me when the light sharpened and made the aspens flare. I stood a long time, and then I did a small human thing. I said each of their first names aloud. Not to magic them into safety, but to give them texture, to give the people the dignity of being called by name. Names have ballast. They cause us to remember that these are not archetypes in a book. They are people whose lives shifted on a small axis and never quite returned to the same spin. The woods, in their ordinary way, rustled. A breeze feathered the leaves. I listened hard, trying to catch the precise fashion of the sound. Was it wind, or was it something else? The mind is malleable. It will pattern for the shape you bring to it. I found myself wanting a lesson, a definitive closing. There was none. There was only a pressing question. If the silence is a kind of warning, how do we teach people to read it without teaching them to live in fear? Maybe the answer is to insist on small, normal things as a countermeasure. To keep talking. To make a list of numbers and bury them where people can find them. To teach children the code words that mean get help. To form groups that sit in rooms with coffee and do not let grief turn private. To make the forests and the hollow places less perfect arenas for loneliness.
When I turned the key and the engine started, the sound felt like a small promise, a human counterfeit for the hush. As I drove out of the hollow road, the last line of trees leaned like a crowd watching a retreat. I could feel the stories leveling in my chest like small stones. They would not go away. They would keep their weight. I promised that I would keep telling them, the way you keep telling the truth back to memory, so memory doesn't grow less by default. The last thing that happened that night was not dramatic. It was a small, private echo. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, and a text lit the glass, an unknown number. My hand tightened around the wheel for an instant before I let the phone be. I did not answer. I thought of the little girl who learned to stay very still when the power blinked, and of the guard who had rehearsed a ransom in his head. I thought of all the people who had been listening for the silence, and by listening, had learned how to live with it. If you ever find yourself alone, under trees, and the world seems to stop making ordinary sounds, move away. Don't stay to solve the riddle. Put a road between you and whatever watches. Tell someone you trust where you are. Carry light. Keep a record. These are not heroic steps. They are human, small measures against an uncertain world. The hollow remains, and the trees, true to their centuries, will do what they have always done. Hold memory in ways the rest of us do not understand. I believe that one good thing we can do is to make these stories small lamps for one another, so that knowledge spreads and people have less reason to discover the same things anew. The engine hummed up the narrow grade, and the town's sodium lights came on like a promise. I parked under one, turned off the car, and sat for a long time looking at the sky. There were no grand answers. There were instead tasks. To listen, to record, to give names back to victims, to protect small routines. The hollow silence is a teacher who gives only questions. If these stories moved you, tell someone else. Share a memory in the comments, something small, a night you felt the world tilt, and maybe that will make the hollow a little less lonely. Subscribe if you want more nights like this. We keep an eye on these roads and on the people who tell the true stories that matter. I locked the truck and walked once more to the lip of the clearing. The air had cooled. The trees did not announce us. They only stood, patient as always. I took one last breath and listened. For a long moment, nothing answered. Then, very faint, a twig snapped somewhere deeper in the copse. An ordinary sound, a raccoon, a deer, a branch settling. It might have been nothing at all. It might have been the kind of small presence that has no malice and no meaning. I felt, nevertheless, the old muscle of attention, the way fear has taught us to listen. I turned the light down the road and left the hollow to its keeping. The forest went completely silent again behind me, not empty, but attentive, holding its breath not in menace, but in the slow, patient way of things that witness.